Pleasant good afternoon or evening, everyone. On behalf of Dr. Anthony L. Jenkins, Coppin State University President, and Dr. Leonte Lewis, Provost and Vice President of Academic Affairs, welcome to Coppin State University's three-part web series on African American women and the 19th Amendment in recognition of Constitution Day. The series is being brought to you by Maryland Humanities, supporter of educational experiences that promote dialogue about our heritage, culture, and our future as Marylanders, and Coppin State University's Constitution Day Committee, comprised of Dr. Mary Wanza, librarian, Dr. Claudia D. Nelson, Chair and Associate Professor of Applied Social and Political Science, Ms. Melissa Rigby, Senior Web Developer, and yours truly, Dr. Jacqueline Rhoden-Trader, Chair and Associate Professor of Criminal Justice. We are grateful for Maryland Humanities sponsorship and the Constitution Day Committee's 5 years of dedicated service to our institution. You may be asking, why are we doing this? Well, first and foremost, we are doing this to edify the populace on the importance of understanding and guarding their constitutional rights and privileges. Secondly, we are adhering to a federal mandate. As of 2004, federal regulations require institutions that receive federal funding to provide a program for students every September 17th about the Constitution. Coppin State University is an institution that receives federal funding and therefore presents this programming in compliance with the legislation, times 3 days. Thirdly, August 2020 marked the centennial of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which was passed on June 4th, 1919 by the United States Congress, guaranteeing all women the right to vote. Regrettably, African American women were not guaranteed the same rights and privileges as their white counterparts and were not able to fully cast their votes until the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Ponder that for a moment. Then ask yourself the following questions. Why did it take African American women so long to cast a vote? Why did they have to wait so long to cast that vote? Why is it important for African American women and historically marginalized groups to exercise their democratic right to vote in all elections? To answer these questions as well as others, this evening, we are delighted to present A Long Walk for African American Women, 125 Years Journey for Voting Rights. Our second masterclass speaker is Dr. Ida D. Jones, University Archivist at our sister university to the east, Morgan State University. Her topic is Fight for the Ballot from the 19th Amendment to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, traversing 1915 through 1965. Dr. Jones administers the Beulah M. Davis Room, which houses the university archives, along with special collections of rare books and manuscript collections. While not at Morgan, she's an adjunct faculty at Lancaster Bible College. She's a newly appointed board member of the Maryland Women's Heritage Center, as well as a board member of the National Collaborative of Women's History Sites. She is serving her second year as co-vice president of the Baltimore City Historical Society. Her publications include 4 books, a variety of encyclopedia entries, and an online exhibition. Her most recent work, Baltimore civil rights leader Victorine Q. Adams and the Power of the Ballot, is the first biographical work on Victorine Adams, the first African-American woman elected to the Baltimore City Council. Finally, Dr. Jones is a consummate scholar who believes deeply in the words of Mrs. Mary Mcleod Bethune, who stated, "Power must walk hand in hand with humility, and the intellect must have a soul." Following the presentation of Dr. Jones, we will have Q&A session. Join me in welcoming Dr. Ida D. Jones to Coppin State University. Dr. Jones.
Good afternoon. Thank you for that rousing introduction, Dr. Rhoden-Trader. Before I start, I'd like to thank the administration at Coppin State University, as well as the Constitution Day Committee, of all the persons you mentioned, yourself included, for inviting me to speak on this evening on behalf of African American women in suffrage. So let me go and share my screen. So, as mentioned, I will be discussing Fight for the Ballot, the 19th Amendment to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. I would like to note that this presentation is dedicated to the late Dr. Rosalind Torborg Penn, who is the Dean of African American Women's History. She was principally the investigator in the 1970s who innovated the field on the campus of Howard University and proliferated through the organization, the Association of Black Women Historians, the academic interest and discipline of African American women's history. To the right of her portrait is her seminal work, African American Women in the Struggle for the Vote, 1850 to 1920. This book, recently published in the 1990s, is still the foundational text in understanding numerous women, African American women and men, who fought for the greater part of the 19th and early 20th century for the franchise for women. So this is dedicated to Dr. Rosalind Torborg Penn. The presentation this evening will follow the format where I'll explore three areas: life in 1915, life after the passage of the 19th Amendment, and new organizations that were formed in response to life. To the right, you see the Crisis magazine cover from August 1915. This is the organ of the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. This particular issue focused on women and the vote and has several seminal articles talking in live time in 1915 about the need for African American women's franchise. So I would suggest that you take this as a note. There'll be a bibliography at the end, but this is an amazing issue that captures in live time the voices of African American men and women in regards to their struggle for the vote. So the timeline this evening will discuss life in 1915, the age of Woodson, Du Bois, and Washington, Woodrow Wilson and the Lily White movement, and the third fracture of the suffrage movement. The second timeline will look at life after the 19th Amendment, Mary Church Terrell and the NAACW and the NAWSA / League of Women Voters, Mary Mcleod Bethune and the NCNW, and Maryland's United States Supreme Court challenge in response to the 19th Amendment. Just an aside, I want to indicate that the women that you see pictured here chronicle the three generations of African American women suffragists who were involved. From left to right is Marianne Shadd Cary, Baltimore-born Frances E.W. Harper, center Mary Church Terrell. Next to her is Nannie Helen Burroughs, and on the side of Burroughs is Daisy Lampkin. So you can research those names because there's quite a cavalcade of women, a constellation of women whose names could not be put into this presentation for the sake of time. But I definitely encourage you to look at the NAACP's Crisis of August 1915, as well as Dr. Penn's book, and the three women I've mentioned, Marianne Shadd Cary, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, Mary Church Terrell, Nannie Helen Burroughs, and Daisy Lampkin. The final timeline will then look at new organized responses. We'll discuss Victorine Q. Adams and her Colored Women's Democratic Campaign Committee, Hamer, Gray, and Devine and the formation of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, and the federal legislation, the Voting Rights Act, and federal protection. I need to kind of morph my little screen here, so pardon me. So the 50 years from 1915 to 1965 witnessed the American Negro struggle for his rights. The tactics have altered in improving climate, but the struggle remained keyed to the search for human dignity. This is an article from Dr. Edgar Toppin in the Negro History Bulletin. So during this course of time, 1915 in particular, we need to look at moment one, the NAACP and their victory in Ginn versus United States that declared unconstitutional the grandfather clause in Oklahoma. Sidebar, in 1870 is when all men, including African-American men, were given the franchise to vote. We are celebrating the sesquicentennial of the 50th Amendment this year as well. Larry Gibson had planned a parade to reenact that was done in Baltimore during the 1800s, and unfortunately COVID sidetracked that, so hopefully they'll be on track for the future. But we're also celebrating, in terms of the 19th Amendment's 100th, the 150th anniversary of the 50th Amendment as well. Moment two, the White House supports the ideal and idea of racial segregation. President Wilson stated, "I do approve of segregation." So the White House, the legal entity, the brain of the country, supported this idea of a vertical relationship between Black and white. So this is the climate in 1915. At the same time, moment three, modern KKK emerges, reviving the original anti-Negro terrorist group, and they added millions of members by 1920. Moment four, the Great Migration shifts, quote, the Negro problem from being a Southern problem to a national issue as African Americans participate in the movement from the Deep South to the Mid-Atlantic, the middle part, and the far west to various places. So they now proliferated and moved themselves out of the Deep South, therefore making, quote, the Negro problem a national issue. Moment five, also in the era of 1915, is the death of Booker T. Washington. His untimely passing led to the rising popularity of the NAACP in concert with a variety of youth organizations to chart a path towards equality. A number of those youth organizations, such as the Southern Negro Youth Congress and other places, were involved with HBCU students. So they're as part of your stewardship, Coppin students. So we talk about Dr. Carter G. Woodson and his association for the study of Negro life and history. Dr. Woodson is seated on the far left of your screen, and what he sought to do was to formulate a response to the oppression and racial discrimination African Americans are feeling in terms of building a corpus of scholarship to understand our history and our antecedents prior to the enslavement as African people, but to also celebrate our history as African people living in America. And you see here, this is a picture of mine, 1929, I believe, with Dr. Woodson and members of the association. Dr. Woodson's vision would also integrate women and children in chronicling Negro life and history in America and throughout the African diaspora. Side note, Mary Mcleod Bethune served as president of the association from 1935, I believe, to 1950. She was the longest serving president and the first female president to serve the association. So she could definitely join in with Woodson's vision to be able to proliferate the education and understanding of our history as a point of pride and not a badge of shame. Concurrently, during this time period, W.E.B. Du Bois forms the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The NAACP was birthed out of the Niagara movement, which happened in the 1904, and sought to create a strategic response to racism. The NAACP was an interracial group of progressives who used legal, academic, publishing, and direct protest to stem the tide of racism. Ida B. Wells, suffragists and journalists, as well as Archibald Grimke, political activists, brought their fiery brand of activism to the NAACP as founders. Lawyers such as Charles Hamilton Houston, Thurgood Marshall, and others would mount legal challenges to discrimination. During this same era, Dr. Booker T. Washington and his Tuskegee Institute, as well as political brokering for the Negro. Dr. Washington, unlike both Woodson or Du Bois, was born enslaved, and he took an accommodationist perspective on racial equality. His notable speech in 1895 during the Atlanta, they call it the Atlanta Exposition, or the Atlanta Compromise, he advocated for African Americans to accept the racial climate and to better themselves through manual labor, the manual arts, and economic empowerment. His untimely death in 1915 seeded the national platform to book Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois and the NAACP to craft a solution to the race problem. So all this is happening during 1915. So you're going to have women fighting for suffrage on one venue. You're going to have the association by Dr. Carter G. Woodson, the NAACP with W.E.B. Du Bois, and Booker T. Washington's Institute and political brokering, all happening during the same time in the African American community. Concurrently, we're going to have the 28th president, Woodrow Wilson, who was going to serve from 1913 to 1921. He's going to be the first Southern-born president since Andrew Johnson in 1869. He's the only president that has served with a PhD. He had an earned PhD in history. And he screened the film Birth of a Nation, which was a vile film that depicted racial stereotypes during this very fragile era. So his language or his rhetoric, coupled with his support towards the idea of white supremacy, let loose the hounds of hell on African American people in various parts of the country, and particularly the South. That's leading to helping push them out of the South and pulling them north with better economic opportunities. Wilson argued that the progress of the Negro must continue along independent lines, that is, along segregated lines, as Dr. Coppin noted. So as we finish from 1915 and we see what's happening both within the African American community with Booker T. Washington, W.B. Du Bois, and Woodson, Dr. Carter G. Woodson, we're also going to see the national conversation that is very chilling in terms of the rhetoric and chilling and derogatory towards African American people. So when we get to the next phase of this discussion, there were a series of fractures in the suffrage movement. The 20th century inherited one that resulted in a fissure between white and Black women. The passage of the 19th Amendment cemented the ideological rift between women's rights and the larger human rights campaign of Black women. The first moment, African American women entered the 20th century organized. They didn't come just slapdash. They were very organized. They had clubs, they had churches, they had different kinds of organizations from reading and literary societies. They were very organized and very strategic in their organization. Moment two, African American women were in all three generations of women who fought for the 19th Amendment. So we don't just come to this in the 20th century. African American women, although not at Seneca Falls in 1848, they were there in the 19th century, Mary Ann Shadd Cary in particular, as well as Frances Harper and others who were actively involved in fighting and arguing for the right for women to vote. Moment number three, racial slights and overt racism did not impede the progress. The suffrage parade in 1913, Ida B. Wells was told to go to the back because Southern women were going to be offended if she sought to walk with the Illinois delegation. And during all of the confusion of organizing the parade, she slipped in with the Illinois delegation. Then we have the HBCU women. It has been documented that Howard University women, who later formed Delta Sigma Theta sorority, were involved. Mary Church Terrell is going to be one of their chaperones, along with another man from Howard named T. Montgomery Gregory. And they're going to march in this as a delegation of college women, resplendent in their academic regalia. It's also important to know that Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority also were involved in this in terms of advocating for the vote and participating in the march. So we have Nellie Quander, who writes a letter to Alice Paul asking to be involved, but letting her know they would not take a Jim Crow position. So both Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority and then Delta Sigma Theta sorority, HBCU women were very much involved in 1913 in the midst of this very volatile and ugly racial era. Moment number four, the intersection of economics, education, and politics galvanized the urgency for women's suffrage, in particular within the African American community. We're going to have Mary Mcleod Bethune opening a school in 1904, and she's going to be able to understand that the apportionments that schools get, the regulations to zoning that schools are subjected to, are all set by elected officials, and they were not going to see that African American institutions thrived. So as a result, we needed to have a vote to be able to elect into office persons who would then understand and be sympathetic to the needs of the economic, educational, and political aspirations of African people. And moment number five, Maryland did not ratify the 19th Amendment in line with other Southern states, seeking to mute the voice and the vote of Black women principally, because African American men had been enfranchised by 1870, and there were various efforts to basically deny them the right to exercise the franchise. As we had heard, grandfather clause, poll tax, literacy tests, what we call extra legal measures are imposed. But African American women after 1920 now would be able to add to the vote as African American men. So it doubled its effort to make sure that African American voices and votes were not included. They were threatened with physical harm, economic backlash, and other kinds of hostile actions to impede their right to vote. So during this era, the African American women during the first quarter of the 20th century are going to up their rights through the empowerment of the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, the NAACP, and the HBCUs to be able to now galvanize a greater stronghold in seeking to galvanize the right to vote. So we talked about the third fracture. So the National Association of Women's Suffrage Association and the League of Women Voters. In 1890, the American Women's Suffrage Association and the National Women's Suffrage Association, they were founded in 1890 because they split over the issue of the Black franchise. So in 1890, there was a split between the white women, and they founded two different organizations. The AWSA sought to go state by state to enfranchise women, whereas the NWSA said we want federal legislation and are solely concerned about women's issues. They conceded in 1890 to unify their efforts for the franchise. And, quote, they developed a compromise that brought more conservative strategies, which moved away from the various feminist issues to focus on women winning the vote. One of the strategies was to ignore the priorities of Black women, an expedient tactic designed to bring white Southern women who did not relish the idea of encouraging Black women to vote. Despite the movement to alienate African American women, several Black women continued to attend the NAWSA meetings, while others concentrated their efforts on convincing their people that gaining political rights for Black women was a means to solving social and economic problems of the race into the 20th century. Black women clearly targeted their own political agendas, and that's according to Dr. Penn, and we're going to see who some of those women are. So the NAWSA becomes the League of Women Voters. The woman pictured here, Carrie Chapman Catt, is going to be the founder in 1920 after the passage of the amendment, and she's going to want an organization that's going to, quote, finish the fight. And this is the beginning of full citizenship for American women. And Catt says, I propose a League of Women Voters, nonpartisan, non-sectarian, to finish the fight and to aid in the reconstruction of the nation. What could be done can be done. What can be done, let us do. And this is from the book by Dr. Jefferson Jenkins. The League of Women Voters inherited the racial fracture as well as the class fracture of the early antecedents of the AWSA and the NWSA. In seeking to answer the question, are all women the same? Viewing themselves as representative of organized women, the League leaders sought to transform the enthusiasm for a common goal into a collective commitment to more limited but specific goals. Internal differences arose, which of hastening the development of procedures for reconciling conflicts exacted an emotional toll. More difficult to absorb was the reaction of older suffrage leaders whose millennial hopes were not immediately realized. Despite its ability to reconcile its internal organizational issues of race, gender, and its legacy of separatism from the NAWSA, the League continued to position itself as a quote-unquote every woman's organization, even while its own ideology reflected segregated membership, not in its bylaws, by its operations in a de facto manner. Dr. Jefferson Jenkins was the first African-American woman to be president of the League of Women Voters. From 1998 to 2002, she ran 2 consecutive terms, and her book really sheds light on terms of how the League of Women Voters has a level of cataract or blindness towards African-American issues. Interestingly enough, she goes further to say that the relationship between the League and African-American people is transactional, which means I need you here for this. It is not transformational in terms of I'm going to help you solve your issues. So we can discuss that later on because that seems to be the way in which the women's movement identifies with African-American women. So now we have the National Association of Colored Women. This organization was founded in 1896, and the Association of Colored Women sought to provide advocacy and solution to problems within the African-American community, from employment to public representation to civil rights. The experience of African-American club women came from an empowering socialization process and particular understanding of womanhood. And that's according to Stephanie Shaw, Dr. Shaw. Interestingly enough, because African-American women, regardless of their station or their complexion or their region of origin, were treated in a subservient and derogatory fashion, it made a level of sorority or sisterhood broadly across all classes, color, and regions of African-American women. And thus the NACWC sought to galvanize those voices and those issues into an organization that would advocate on behalf of all women. The first president and one of the founders is Mary Church Terrell. She served as the national president, and she traveled nationally and internationally, speaking on the quest for human rights for African Americans. She also participated in direct action protests demanding equal rights. And as I said, she led a delegation of Howard University students in 1913 in the suffrage parade. She was fluent in 3 languages, and she utilized her broad appeal and understanding to liberate African people and equitize Black women throughout her life. Here she is in a lovely gown, and in the 1915 crisis that I mentioned, she says, even if I believe that women should be denied the right of suffrages, Wild horses could not drag such an admission from my pen or my lips. More and more is it beginning to be understood that the mother's zeal for the ballot is prompted by her solicitude for her family circle, that the child's food may be pure, that his environment shall be wholesome, and his surroundings sanitary. These are the things which engage her thought. The ballot, the sign of power, the means by which things are brought to pass, the talisman that makes our dreams come true. Her demand, votes for women, is votes for children. So she was linking the idea of social inequity, social injustice, to not being able to have a voice in the ballot box on behalf of the African American community. The next person I'd like to talk about is Mary Mcleod Bethune. She was an educator, political activist, and women's rights advocate. She founded Bethune-Cookman College, which is now Bethune-Cookman University. She also founded the National Council of Negro Women, and she's also one of the co-founders of the United Negro College Fund. She too spoke nationally and internationally on racial and gender equity issues or equality issues. Mrs. Bethune was the first African American and the first African American woman appointed to a federal government cabinet. She utilized her position to distribute funds and direct resources to aid rural, poor, and other marginalized groups. And it goes further in terms of her suffrage activity, having a political voice would enable African American women to ameliorate poor conditions of public schools, housing, and other social services. The NAACWC had local and regional clubs throughout the country, with smaller neighborhood groups to support the cause. However, their contributions were systematically stymied as many national suffrage organizations attempted to placate white supremacist Southern suffragists. This did not impede the progress of Bethune in her pursuits of her form of women's suffrage. Bethune operated with political ambidextrous efficiency. As we know, she was appointed by President Franklin Roosevelt to the National Youth Administration, one of his Depression-era activities. And from that position, she was able to galvanize attention, support, and move into an advocacy for African Americans and fair employment throughout the 1940s and after World War II. Another woman of note, and like I said, there are so many women I could not seemingly avoid. I want to mention two other women, Mary Burnette Talbert. She was born on September 18, 1866. She was a club woman and a leader. In 1916, she was the president of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, and she dedicated her administration and her life to social, political, and economic equality for African American people. I forgot to mention that Mary Mcleod Bethune was also a president of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, and she, during her tenure in 1928, helped them acquire their first national headquarters in Washington, D.C. Margaret Murray Washington was more than a widow. She was the third wife of Booker T. Washington, and she was an educated and outspoken equal rights activist. She spoke nationally for the Federation of Colored Women's Clubs, and she worked to educate rural women, prisoners, and youth. She was a suffragist who advocated for women's rights and universal suffrage. So once again, you find Booker T. Washington, who took a rather conservative stance, and his wife is taking a much more, aggressive stance in terms of her quest for political rights. Now, when we come to the state of Maryland, it's very interesting because Maryland challenges the 19th Amendment. The federal amendment did not set well with the select state officials, and similar to other southern states, Maryland did not like it. This Baltimore judge, pictured here, Judge Lesser, sued to remove the names of two women from registered voting, or remove the names of two registered women voters. And quote, in a unanimous decision on February 27, 1922, the court found that the 15th Amendment had stood for 50 years as proof voting rights could be extended. Federal law overruled state laws on the issue of voting. So his point, or its point, was moot. And this is from Rick Hutzel's article. Maryland still does not ratify the 19th Amendment until March 29, 1941, and did not certify that vote until February 25, 1958. So one could question if the vote is not important, and if African Americans were too intellectually subpar to be able to really understand the power of it, why was there such a struggle to take it away from us or simply nullify or dismiss our effort to use it? So now we enter the third phase of the conversation. As Black women became voters, they lobbied for political candidates, organized voter education groups in their own communities, ran for a variety of offices, and fought attempts by Southern racists to keep them from the polls. The 19th Amendment was a shallow one. The victory of the 19th Amendment was a shallow one for Black women. With these bitter lessons behind them, Black women redirected their energies toward other race-centered political goals. And that's from Dr. Rosalind Terborg Penn's book. Moment one, the legal challenges orchestrated by the NAACP slowly dismantled Jim Crow in a state-by-state fashion, while voting rights organizations waged battles state by state. Moment number two, the third generation of suffragists had modeled and mentored young women into greater agency during World War II. So even though the activism of the suffrage women would pass away as they passed away, they passed the mantle of agency, activism, organization, and membership to younger women. So you find this overlapping situation in which African American women are getting this instruction and carrying it further. And you're going to see some of these women as we move forward. Moment number three, Victorine Q. Adams, in the tradition of Baltimore City school teachers, organized the Colored Women's Democratic Campaign Committee. Moment number four, Fannie Lou Hamer, Victoria Gray Adams, and Annie Devine represented the first national partisan crusade for political office. And moment number five, passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act was a direct result of increasing visibility and vocality for African American women. So Victorine Adams was a charter member of the Baltimore section of the National Council of Negro Women. She was acquainted with Mrs. Bethune and heartily embraced her vision of universal suffrage. Towards this end, in 1946, she founded the Colored Women's Democratic Campaign Committee. The CWDCC believed making the political process relatable, engaging the entire community, men, women, and children about the ballot, and increasing civic consciousness and political accountability. Here she's pictured with Phil Goodman and members of the CWDCC in her home, where they're inquiring of the candidate his agenda and his campaign promises to those who would consider voting for him. The CWDCC is meeting here with Charles Tilden, who is standing, and their motto was, if democracy is worth fighting for, it's worth voting for. Its members sought to welcome all women, register all, enlighten all, and interest more women in politics, stimulate and educate the public on the value of the ballot, register more people, get the vote out at election time, and to take part in the civic, political, and social progress of the city. So it wasn't just simply electoral moments. They wanted a conscious 365, 24/7 understanding of politics because it impacts every aspect of our lives as citizens in this country. To this other extent was the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. This was founded on April 26, 1964, as a voter registration project for African Americans in Mississippi. The voter suppression in Mississippi resulted in physical, economic, and fatal attacks on African Americans who attempted to exercise their 15th and 19th Amendment rights. Remember, we're talking about the 15th Amendment, it's 150 years. The 19th Amendment, it's 100 years. So a coalition of college students, residents, and NAACP officers and the Black press sought to end this practice. The igniting incidents. So in the same summer, well, that's the spring is when it was founded, 1964. In summer of 1964, there were the murders of Michael H. Schwerner, Andrew Goodman, and James Chaney. This impelled the urgency to end the murderous retribution African American voting registration had. Towards this end, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party organized a slate of delegates and went to the 1964 Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City to challenge the constitutionality of the all-white Democratic delegation from Mississippi. And this would be their leader, Fannie Lou Hamer. Fannie Lou Hamer was a native of Mississippi who became an advocate for voting rights as she linked societal inequity to those in elected office. She was fearless, tireless advocate. She endured physical beatings, threats, and economic challenges from her voting rights advocacy. Nevertheless, she persisted. It's also important to note that Fannie Lou Hamer did not seemingly have a great degree of education. She was the 19th of her parents' 20 children, and she worked as a sharecropper. And so once she had the right to understand that she was a citizen and the right to vote, she was sold on the idea. She would not register to vote until the age of 44 years old, but she made sure that she registered and took others with her and used both the speaking, singing, and the Black press to advocate for those changes. So the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party delegation included Victorine Victoria Gray Adams, and Annie Devine. So on the left is Fannie Lou Hamer, in the middle is Victoria Gray Adams, and to her left is Annie Devine. Other members of the delegation included Lawrence Guyot, Aaron Henry, Robert Moses, Peggy J. Connor, and Edwin King. This contingency included Native Mississippians, civil rights activists, and student leaders. I also want to point out that throughout the history of African American suffrage in the macro, for men, women were involved. And throughout the micro suffrage movement for women, African American men were involved. So we were not divided in terms of some of the way the scholarship wants to placate it, but we were in fact far more united than we were given credit for in some of the scholarship. So here we have Fannie Lou Hamer testifying before the Democratic National Convention. During her speech, she described in great detail the horrible beating she was subjected to when in prison. She was arrested and put in prison, and police instructed 2 other male prisoners to beat her and expose her body. As a result of registering to vote, she concluded, all of this is on account of we want to register, to become first-class citizens. And if the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party is not seated, I question America. Is this America, the land of the free and the home of the brave? Our lives be threatened daily because we want to live as decent human beings in America. She's also in this speech mentions the phrase, I'm tired of being tired, or sick and tired of being sick and tired. So this speech she gave is a remarkable speech that is in the annals of 20th century civil rights history. Hamer's impassioned speech contributed greatly to the passage of the, passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. I'll try and find a way to do this. Hamer pulled back the curtain. The United States could not claim to be a democracy while holding voting rights for millions of its citizens. Although the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party delegation did not secure its intended seats at the convention, her address, combined with a nationwide protest led by Black activists, compelled President Lyndon B. Johnson, who had interrupted her speech with a press conference of his own, to introduce federal legislation that banned local laws like literacy tests that blocked African Americans from the ballot box. The act also put in place restrictions on how certain states could implement new election laws, new election laws. That's from Keisha Blaine's article. So here we have President Lyndon B. Johnson with Dr. Martin Luther King after he signs into law the 1965 Voting Rights Act. I want to highlight that in the checkered or the black and white dress is Patricia Roberts Harris, who would go on to be one of the Labor, Department of Labor, I believe. She was the chairman of the Department of Labor, Howard University Graduate School of Law. And when we look at the future, during the 1960s, Dr. Coppin recalls a powerful level of national pressures being exerted through the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This law is rapidly crumbling many barriers, Negro pioneers, and opening doors for others of their race. Negroes are pioneering and opening doors for many of their race. Humbled by the magnitude of the hurdles yet to be surmounted, but heartened by the perspectives of the long climb since 1915, the Negro stands determinedly in 1965, fearlessly facing the future, and we shall overcome. The victory of African American women's suffrage between 1915 and 1965. In essence, the 5 generations of African American women who fought for full citizenship resulted in universal suffrage and agency for human rights. From Mary Ann Shadd Cary and her crusade in 1870 to Nannie Helen Burroughs' suffrage activity within the National Baptist Convention Women's Department in 1909, to Charlotta Bass, a journalist and politician who ran in 1952 as the vice presidential candidate for the Progressive Party, to Fannie Lou Hamer and her 3 campaigns for elected office in the 1960s, sought to crack open elected positions. This is the bibliography that I'd like to share with you. I'll leave it for a few minutes, but I mentioned Keisha Blaine, Rick Hutzel, Carolyn Jefferson Jenkins, my 2 books and articles, Cynthia Nevedon Morton, Stephanie Shaw, Rosalind Terborg Penn, and Edgar Toppin. If you look at Dr. Nevedon Morton's work and Dr. Penn's work and Dr. Shaw's work, you'll get an understanding of not just women, but in Baltimore is what Dr. Nevedon Morton focused on. And Dr. Toppin gives a lovely overview of that 50-year time period between 1915 in 1965. So this I'm going to leave for a few seconds for you to look at. And finally, I'd like to thank you. I hope something shared will inspire you to vote and to share this rich history of agency with your community. Thank you. Your mic is muted too, dear.
Technology. Thank you so very much, Dr. Jones. I've been edified. I was taking copious notes as you were speaking. And so we are absolutely delighted that you're able to join us. And at this juncture, we would like to afford the listening audience the opportunity to pose queries. For those of you who are listening, we ask that you write your questions in the Q&A only, not in the chat section, just in the Q&A section. And then I will review them and field them to Dr. Jones in the order that I received them. So we've got about 30 minutes or so where we can entertain questions. Ready? Let's see. I don't see any questions at this moment. Audience, we don't want you to be shy. There must have been something that Dr. Jones said that made you think about your own work, some things you have studied over the years. She mentioned our very own illustrious faculty member, Dr. Cynthia Neverdon Morton, and the speaker yesterday introduced her as well in his bibliography. A great historian, captured a lot of what has gone on in Baltimore. And so for me, a non-native Baltimorean, it was very nice to take that walk through time to get to the year of my actual birth. Very interesting. So I was being very pensive and introspective about the many women who've gone on before me and the work that they have done.
I mentioned one correction. A colleague of mine just noted that Patricia Roberts Harris was the chairman of the HUD, Housing and Urban Development, not the Secretary of Labor. So I thank her very much for her correction. She's a member of Delta Sigma Theta sorority, and I want to make sure that I do just diligence to that in my Howard alum as well. So thank you.
I'll leave it to those Deltas to correct. Us Deltas, I should say. Well, we Deltas. All right, very well. Let's see, we've got another question here. All righty. I'm interested in acquiring Dr. Jones's book on Victorine Q. Adams. Is it available through the Coppin bookstore or Everyone's Place on North Avenue? Brother Nataki.
It should be available. I know that Dr. Wanza made sure that she purchased copies for the library, so it should be at the library. If not, she might be able to work with the bookstore, and it should be at Everyone's Place, I would think, as well.
All right, fantastic. Another query. This person has prefaced it with, I hate to make this about men, but any thoughts on what did Black women's suffrage feel about Black men gaining the vote and not women in general, and Black women in particular?
That's an excellent question. Dr. Penn's work does speak to that very clearly, because the scholarship prior to her work had said that there was just a great division along gender lines, as you're saying, that women wanted it for women, and then when men got it, all women were against all men. That has never been the case in the African-American community. There was our lovely Frances E.W. Harper, who was alive at that time and very much involved. And when the situation came up to be inclusive about the franchise going to both men and women, and then eventually the government choosing just to enfranchise men only, Frances Harper said, I laid down the issue of sex for the race, because African-American men will carry my issue into the ballot box on my behalf. So as a result of that, she chose to stick with race over gender, because they didn't see her as a woman that's Black. They saw her as a Black woman. So she was continually pigeonholed because of her race, not her gender. At the same time, there's a man named Robert Purvis, who was very much against the franchise for men, because as an African-American man, he had 2 daughters. So he said, either we all get the vote, or we all don't get the vote. So there were African-American men who were disgusted with the fact that women were not included in the franchise. And then just to add another cherry on this conversation is Mary Ann Shadd Cary, who was going to register to vote in the District of Columbia in the 1870s and say that there's no, and she was in law school too at Howard, and she said there's no stipulation saying that gender can't vote. So you did not put that in there to say that women can't vote. So as a human being on the planet who's part of this inclusion, according to the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment, I should be allowed to vote. And she talks before the House Judiciary Committee on this, and eventually they listened to her, and she is denied the right to vote. But there were challenges to it because that did not say gender persons could not vote. So there was some schisms there, and they were principally in favor of Black men getting the vote, or those who were displeased with the fact that women are not included.
Thank you, thank you. All righty, another query is how unified were Black and white women together in the organization of the NAWS/the League of Women Voters when segregation was an issue?
Unfortunately, African American women were simply written out of the narrative concurrently. So between the 1848 and Seneca Falls, there were no Black women present. By the time of the 1870s, there's going to be huge friction between Black women and white women over the vote and over the franchise. And some of the ugly things that white women said about calling people like Douglas Sambo, as well as other derogatory terms for white ethnics and Asian men who were given the franchise. It wasn't just Black men. We need to understand that all men who were propertyless men were included in 1870. So they were very clear on their vitriol toward these people who they thought were subpar and uneducated, where their wives and daughters should have been given the franchise because they had the level of civility. So you're finding these fractures. I mentioned there were 3 fractures. So by the time you get to the formation of the League of Women Voters, it is very clear that it's not that you're not wanted, but we're not including you. So you can come and you can sit, but your issues won't be an issue for us. And so Mary Church Terrell, as well as Mary Mcleod Bethune, often did approach the League of Women Voters to support them in various national efforts they were doing, and they received tacit response. I think if you look at Carolyn Jeffrey's book, you're going to find some fascinating conversations. In the 1940s, the League creates this thing called the Negro problem. It says, how do we discuss the Negro problem? So the women who are Black women who are members of the League said, shouldn't we change that to the issue of racial issues in the League? So even the language during the 1940s was rather chilling in terms of that. And it's not because I don't think it was deliberately violent, but it was simply oblivious. If it's not my issue, I don't think about it. If you're not handicapped, you don't need a ramp to get into a building. You wouldn't think about that. So white women, because they did not have the burden of race to carry, just didn't think about that. So as a result, they just simply closed their eye and further allowed it to remain closed. When issues of lynching, segregation, integration, they did not respond to any of those national issues as a league. They simply just looked the other way. So.
Oh, thank you so much. Following up with that, you mentioned something about us being left out, and that we were considered to be, and this is my word, daft. However, why did they make such a significant effort to keep us from getting to the polls? It seems to mirror what is happening today. Can you kind of discuss that?
That's a very good question, and that's one that I always query myself, and we can pretty much see that the answer is in the question, that there is some level of power to this. And so numerically, African Americans were considered a minority. However, now in the 21st century, when you add Asians, Latinos, and other, quote, marginalized group, that makes us a majority. And then that will now displace those individuals who are maintaining position for power and control. So when you really distill it down to its base issue, the whole idea of the vote or the franchise is about power and control. And there's a certain Western narrative that says that power and control belong in white male hands. White, male, moneyed, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant hands, because there's not even kind of unity amongst white men. So when as we who are on the outside analyze that, we can see that there's fracture, but they will close ranks. Poor white men who are sitting toothless in West Virginia will close ranks with the President Trump, who's worth millions, who could care less about how they're living because of the issue of racial politics. So the idea that we're being used as a political football or ignored or not included is because it has a level of power that now leads to economic wealth, international relationships, and the idea of just power. Who is going to be the neck to turn the head around? So that is why I'm totally convinced that the ballot, even the one vote, is so important, because it then shifts the balance of power and makes this space now one where we all can sit at the table or no one can sit at the table.
Very well, thank you, thank you. Listening audience, I need you to keep your questions coming. I could ask a lot, but it's not about me, it's about you. So please use this opportunity to pose some questions in the Q&A. And while I wait for another question, then let me ask about 3 variables that you introduced. in terms of making the vote or make voting count, voting needs to be relatable, engaging, yielding civic consciousness. Can you speak a little bit about these three variables as they relate to our present day?
That's a very good question as well. Once again, I have to give Dr. Cynthia Neverdun Morton credit for that, because her work talks about the African-American women school teachers. And what I've come to realize past 1925, where her book comes to an end, is that idea of African-American public school teachers in Baltimore pretty much form the entire matrix of the civil rights movement. Because they're educators and because they understand that we need to be informed, they use the instructive or pedagogical training in the classroom in social settings. So what Victorine's group sought to do was to make it relevant and actually relatable. So she actually bought a machine. She bought a voting machine. We actually have it in the collection at Morgan. So you can actually engage the physical machine. So the idea of being able to engage the machine is extremely important, because you say, well, I just have one vote, I don't matter. And when you look at the percentage points and how people lose positions, whether it's by 2% or 3%, let's look at 2018 now with Stacey Abrams. There's a lovely video called Suppressed. It's online, Suppress the Fight for the Vote. And it examines the 2018 election with Stacey Abrams. Well, I've learned from a colleague that in that election that was lost by, small single-digit percentage points, there were 2.5 million voters in Georgia who did not vote. Of the 2.5 million, 900,000 were African American. So even though he did everything to steal the election, to suppress the vote, to confuse people, and to cause problems, had a percentage of that 900,000 voted, it would have pushed aside all of the collusion that had gone on. So as a result, what Victorine's group sought to do as educators, and what I think we should do in this age, is to understand that when you don't participate, you're still going to be held accountable, or the consequence is going to come for you. So we don't have to believe in climate change. We can, do whatever we want to do. When the fires continue to burn and they continue to cause weird weather systems and patterns, then, that's just happening because it's weird, when it's never happened before in modern time. So you're going to be held accountable to the consequence, regardless of whether you believe it's real or not. So I think that is what she sought to do. And I think that's what we need to do in this generation. I've spoken to teenagers and first-time voters who are like, well, it doesn't make a difference. There's no one that appeals to me. We all can say no one appeals to us. Neither one of the parties appeal to us, but we are in the binary choice. That's all we have at this juncture. So you need to hold your nose and vote for somebody. And then when the consequences come down, now you can move to have those changes done. But sitting here and kind of just apathetic indifference, you're going to still be held to the consequence. So when social services go away, when Social Security goes away, when they make the draft mandatory, whatever other kinds of mechanisms that are going to go on, the judges that have been installed for lifetime appointments that are going to now legislate laws about police brutality, other kinds of things that are sitting on the bench with chilling effect, it's going to affect your life. So at least have some effort. And you look at the bloody history that these women went through, and the men, to secure the vote. It's culturally criminal as an African person, whether you're domestic born or international, as an African person, to sit in this day and age and say, what difference does it make? Even if you write your name in the line, even if you just choose to write your name, you're not going to throw away that right, because it's being taken away. So it's just.
Very, very poignant remarks. Thank you so very much. Those of us who are professors, we need to find a succinct way to share that information with our students. It's incumbent upon us to do so. The next question is, well, actually, this is a comment. You're being thanked, and you've had a few. This one says, thank you for this fascinating presentation. Will the recording and/or slides be available for us to share with our students? We are recording, and Ms. Jackson will take care of making sure that we get copies of all of these series. There is a question as well. Due to the present climate in this country, do you think the Republican White House and Senate will basically steal the election to avoid Trump from being a one-term president?
That's a very good question. And I actually was talking to a variety of colleagues. I think they're in Pennsylvania, other parts of like Ohio. They said there's no theft that's even required because people are blindly voting for him. They're blindly supporting Trump along those same racial political lines we talked about. There was one woman I read about, I think in the New York Times, in New Hampshire or Vermont, and she was wearing a Trump t-shirt into the primary elections or something. And so you can't wear that shirt in here. That's partisan. She took off her shirt and voted chest, whatever, topless. So if you have that kind of doggedness to support your political party for whatever reason you believe, then it would be very unreasonable for him to attempt to steal. But there will be some frustration in the efforts. And we know that the Russians are also meddling and such like that. And then the great disinformation campaign that's going on. So there'll be these efforts to gerrymander and kind of, flirt and funk with it. But I don't think you'll have to steal it, because there's a great level of apathy that we're seeing on both sides, both Democratic and Republican, young and old. And we can't Frankenstein a candidate. The age of Obama is over, whether you liked him or you didn't. So we have to kind of deal with the realities of it now. And side note is that his son, Donald Jr., is preparing for his 2024 campaign. He thinks this is like a dynastic thing, that he's going to be running in 2024. So if you listen to the rhetoric of what's being said and look at the way in which you're living in terms of social services, the pandemic, and other things that affect real lives, then you could just simply infer, if this is the leadership we've experienced, how is that benefiting me? And if that is benefiting you, well, congratulations. If it's not benefiting you, then what do you need to do to change that or to become a beneficiary of that?
Thank you. Thank you. It's getting heavy, Dr. Jones. It's getting heavy, but that's what we need sometimes, to be action-oriented. Next question. In light of your comments of the collective power of organized people of color and ethnic whites, how salient or relevant was reproductive rights to this period in discussion, and by association, the production of laborer and market potential? Is there any relation to social Darwinism with that?
Yes, there is. Margaret Sanger and her crusade, as well as eugenics and pseudoscience, were very much involved at that particular time. So you're going to find the NACWC really looking at the idea of hygiene and sanitation for African American people, because there was an assumption that we were just simply unclean and therefore prevalent to getting tuberculosis and other kinds of diseases. Sounds kind of reflective of this time period, because of our poor hygiene. When it wasn't poor hygiene, it was overcrowded housing that led to certain proliferations of certain diseases and certain kinds of other, and then poor nutrition, because once again, the economy was not there to buy the kinds of things. So there was a constellation of issues that contributed to some of those issues about reproductive rights, as well as health and longevity issues and mortality rates. So you can definitely find conversation with the club women in particular, and even Bethune's National Council of Negro Women. She actually had Dorothy Farabee, Dr. Farabee, talk about the idea of women's health, as well as Dr. Fleming Kittrell, another person talking about nutrition and health. These women were PhDs and MDs who really are coming in the 40s and 50s and really talking about these issues. And then of course you had the campaigns that were kind of morally questionable, where they were just sterilizing people. Whether you were considered, quote, subpar intellectually, or whether you were considered a racial anomaly, they would just simply sterilize people and telling them they're getting, quote, health treatments. So there's been a nefarious way in which medical science, organized medical science, as well as just simply economic harsh realities, impacted health and wellness for African American women and children. And at the same time, also side note, in 1913, Booker T. Washington debuts his National Negro Health Week in Baltimore. If you look at the Afro-American, you're going to find this idea of Negro Health Week that Booker T. Washington is going to kind of launch in Baltimore to address the idea of tuberculosis. You had Providence Hospital in Baltimore at the same time, working to ameliorate poor health conditions for African Americans, that went to nutrition, housing issues, and other kinds of things that always go back to economy, which is politically driven. So everything goes back to that ballot in terms of labor and access and wealth.
Very well, thank you, thank you. An audience member would like to know if you've got any suggestions on how we might encourage the younger generation to remain hopeful and to vote given the current political climate.
That is a hard question, because as we discussed pre-show, that they have a different way of engaging. They're rather insular and screenagers for the most part. So it's not on a screen, they don't really identify with it. And it is extremely disappointing and dismal. But I think if they knew their history, and the words of Lift Every Voice come to me, over a way of tears that have been watered, treading a blood path through the blood of the slaughtered, that we have seen darker days and we have been through darker times as a people. And as a result of that, surviving is what we've tended to do, with the intention that a better day was coming. So whether you look at my mother's generation, the Depression era, born during the 1930s, and just kind of not realizing they're poor because that's the reality they knew. They didn't realize they were poor. Or my grandparents who were immigrants from other countries coming here trying to send money home to other people who were far worse in their poverty. So when you look at that and seeing that one of their grandsons graduates from Harvard University, another granddaughter has a PhD doing this. So they didn't see it because they couldn't even finish school. My maternal grandmother only went to school intermittently because it cost 3 pennies a day. So she could not afford to go to school. And my grandfather made it to 3rd standard in Barbados. So they didn't see the idea of college education. They knew their kids were going to get through high school. That's what they're going to do. And then the kids of the high school said, well, these kids are going to get through college. And so that has been the progression. It has been what we call delayed gratification. And unfortunately, in the digital age, we want instant gratification. I mean, microwave quick. And that's not the way it's going to happen. And I think the burden on this generation is actually a blessing because they have the digital space and the global reach that generations would have to wait to address the label, send the mail, get to the, it was far more an analog, but this digital space allows them to be able to converse, connect, and communicate globally in ways that are just lightning fast. That the change might not come as fast, but the circulation of information, the galvanizing of ideas, the organization of these activities can happen in those fast moments that can then lead to that change. And just a side note, there's a great group called Woke Vote. Her name is Joanna Thompson. I think she's out of Alabama, Woke Vote. And so she's teaching HBCU students on how to register people to vote and to go out and talk to their own peer group. Because those of us who might be Gen Xers or Boomers or wherever we are, who are not, 21, really kind of can't communicate to them in terms of the way in which to understand the burden of their reality. Because we've lived some of this, so it doesn't affect us as much. But when that's your no prom, no this, no that, it's got to be very stultifying. And then the brain isn't fully formed till 25. So there's a lot they're dealing with that we have to acknowledge that we don't fully understand anymore because we're so far past it. But this Woke Vote group, as well as a variety of Black Girls Vote, who are in that age group, who understand and communicate and understand emotionally that level of, I don't know what's called depression, but sadness, is able to pull them into some level of consciousness better than the rest of us. So I think it's going to have to be intergenerational. And definitely the HBCU campus is ripe for its history of being those spaces to incubate those ideas.
Very well, thank you, thank you. It has been said that Gen Z are conscious in that they're demonstrating having their own types of sit-ins and asking for racial equality, but actually getting them to the polls might be a lot more difficult than the rhetoric or the posters that they hold up at the very marches that they attend. So we will work diligently as historians and as part of the African American legacy to try to get them to connect their activism with the actionable outputs as well. One other comment, only because I don't see a question and I'm going to pose it, I'll make the comment, is that you talked about subpar intellectual earlier, and it made me think of Booker T. Washington. Not that I'm saying he was a subpar intellectual, but he was an enslaved person, born enslaved, and so the majority may have considered him to be, or they did, a subpar, not even intellectual, just subpar human being, and juxtapose him to Woodrow Wilson, the PhD, the terminal degree, the highest of echelons that you can get for being esteemed and intellectual and empirically awake, so to speak, yet he pens Birth of a Nation and this vile depiction of his fellow human being. So the question is, who is subpar in terms of intellect? No,
very good question. Just quickly, Birth of a Nation was a 3-hour silent film that Wilson does air at the White House. So the film itself, having white men in blackface doing these things to Lillian Gish, she throws herself over the cliff instead of being ravaged by the savages. It was always connected to the idea that Black was inferior. And Winthrop Jordan does a very good job in his book, White Over Black, that talks about the concept that it starts in Europe. So before even African Americans are imported, or Africans are imported to be enslaved, that they understand that Black is dirty, Black is beneath. So there's a whole kind of nomenclature to this in European culture. And so as a result, they just simply now found a people to impose those ideas upon and kind of make them anthropomorphize themselves. So Wilson very clearly doesn't see a problem with the idea that you people do that there, even if you're not people because you're savages. But, and then we, the people, do this over here. So
And
you have a
that
good question.
continues.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, Dr. Jones, it has been a pleasure, and I thank you on behalf of Coppin State University, its faculty, its staff, its students, those joining us outside of the university. Your presentation has been edifying. I hope it stirs us to action, that once we get off this call, that we will make some calls, text some people to say, look, you must get out and rock this vote. People died for you to have this right, and so do not squander it. And so we thank you, thank you, thank you. Heartfelt thanks to the Maryland Humanities for sponsoring our web series. Again, to Dr. Ida D. Jones, to the Constitution Committee, and special thank you to Ms. Kelly Jackson and Mr. Robert Harper for our IT specialist, who we could not put this broadcast on without them. And thank you to our listening audience for tuning in. We hope that you will join us tomorrow evening for part 3 of our series entitled The Struggle Continues, Preserving and Protecting Our Voting Rights, 1965 to 2020, featuring our very own Dr. Claudia D. Nelson. Thank you all very much. Oh, there's one question, and I'm going to give that person the chance to get their question aired. It is, how did Black women advocates of the universal suffrage movement encourage Black women outside the organization to vote when many of them were in fear?
Well, we had a situation in Florida with Mary Mcleod Bethune where she was on the front lines with the women. So they were literally standing rank, arm in arm in these spaces. And as I said earlier, African-American women, because of racism and Jim Crow, were not seen as one that's educated, one that's not educated. They were simply just Black people. So the idea of physical violence, the idea of economic threats, they withstood them. And actually, there was one situation in Florida where they would take any white voter and put ahead of the line of the African-American standing in line. They had to wait 7, 8, 10 hours to vote, but they said, hold the line, maintain the line. And they stood there until they were allowed to vote. So there was an understanding, and I said in an earlier program somewhere that that's one thing that I really remarked, that they put their physical bodies in the space. I mean, Fannie Lou Hamer being beaten, and you'll hear more about that, I'm sure, from Dr. Nelson on tomorrow. She physically took it, and she said, if I fall, I'll fall 5 feet 4 inches into the future so that this can be done. So she was willing to sacrifice her physical life, her physical body, for a right. And for those generations she would never live to see. So that kind of power it's beyond it. You've transcended the sense of your mortality. You've transcended, you're in a whole divine space now that these women understood for their children to have a better life.
Well, it appears that our fortitude and our tenacity are the great threats of the majority, because still we rise.
Exactly.
Thank you all so very much, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Pleasant good evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.